welcome back. Today we're having a chat with James Sutherland. James was the CEO of Cricket Australia for 20 years and is now the CEO of Golf Australia. We're going to be exploring today the inequities in sport and how the culture in sport has evolved over recent decades. I'm really looking forward to having this chat and can't wait to hear what comes out of it.
It is a little bit of a this is your life, and that's what we do like. We like to start at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start. See what I did there? James, you've obviously grown up playing a lot of sport. I'm assuming that most people who go into being sports administrators start off by playing a lot of sport. I don't know. I feel as a young person playing a lot of sport myself, I learned a hell of a lot of things like, community connection or performance or discipline that came through, particularly playing team sport. Is that the case for you? And did you ever consider that you would still be part of a sporting world at this age when you're a little kid within your short pants?
Look, I don't think so, Chris. Jobs in sport in the times when I was growing up were probably not even there. The administrators were probably completely volunteers in those days. But I mean, to say that to suggest that I was infatuated by sport as a young person would be an understatement. It was my whole existence really as a kid. That's what I loved to do, and I actually grew up at a school, a boarding school in Victoria where my dad was a teacher, and because it was a boarding school, the teachers lived on the property with their kids, and so I had this amazing playground. And I also had these role models who were kids in the school who were older than me, who were playing all sorts of sport. And my one ambition was to play in the first 18 or to play in the first 11 and to emulate the feats of the people that I looked up to who were the senior kids in the school.
Yeah, right. But you didn't immediately go down that path. From my understanding, you were a chartered accountant for a time? And
that's right. Yeah.
And then what then took you – that was outside of the sporting industry?
Yeah, so I was career-wise, I went down a path. I did a commerce degree and then worked for Ernst & Young. That was my sort of initial job after university, if you like. At the same time, I was trying to play professional cricket, not very well, but I was struggling away with that, and I would be forever grateful for my employer, Ernst & Young at the time, for I guess, releasing me at times to play, allowing me to train and to at least look back on my career without having any regrets that I didn't at least give it a crack.
Yeah, right. There's a great thing. There's a guy that works with us at Interchange who said something recently, which I thought was fantastic. There's a sort of a unique side to cricket and golf now, as you as CEO of Golf Australia, where you spend kind of half your time on the sidelines. And he says that there's actually a great part of that, particularly for young men, that they're sitting on the sidelines. They've got to find something to talk about because for the other half of the time they're on the field, the other time they're sitting, and they've got to talk about stuff, whether it be stuff that's going on at home or stuff that's going on at school or issues with their partners or whatever it might be. There's a social side which is a huge benefit, I think, to growing up playing team sport as well. There's no question in that, James. Just thought I'd say there's a statement right there. I have no question.
No, but let me follow on because it's, as a cricketer, that's the one thing I really miss about the game and about playing it. You come together as a team to play the game, but it's actually different to lots of other sports because you do spend half the time, particularly if you're not very good at batting like I was, on the sidelines just talking rubbish with your mates. And you don't just talk about the game, you talk about everything. And it's the bond. I think the bonds that you get from playing a sport like that is a storytelling sport that has a different sort of cadence about it, is something really special. And I guess I would say that as a cricketer, but I do genuinely feel that it's one of the unique virtues of the game, and indeed I see that in golf as well.
Sport has grown massively in recent years. Media rights, membership, participation. People. There's always the line that it's not sport, it's business. You look at the Olympics or the World Cup or the extraordinary events that are put on that capture massive amounts of viewers. Where is sport leading business and vice versa? Where is sport leading the direction and where is it lagging behind in business, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think that there's something about sport in the high performance environment where there's a real honesty around performance that you just can't hide from. There's a scoreboard, but there's also a team, particularly in a team environment. There's a scoreboard, but there's also there's a sense of role in good teams. At least there's a sense of role clarity and accountability that is, I think, superior to most work organisations. And because there's a scoreboard and because there's particularly at an elite level where there's a real intensity and scrutiny around performance, you're exposed if you don't perform, and those messages come loud and clear. They don't always come in the best, they're not sugar-coated. They're usually pretty direct. But I think that's something that I've always observed around sport, that that role clarity, the sense of duty, purpose around winning or getting the outcome, and then the review, the process of review that happens every week. So it doesn't happen very. I mean, we think about in a work environment, maybe 6 monthly reviews. Good organisations are doing that maybe every 6 months. But in footy or cricket or whatever, you review that with quite a level of scrutiny week in, week out. And then you try to get better and go and do it again. So that's what I would observe around, at least in the performance sense, around sport.
Just to add to that, something that we've discussed a few times in terms of coaching, and particularly CEO or executive coaching, there tends to be a pattern of hiding away your coaches. So I do a lot of executive coaching with a number of CEOs, but they're not very public about that. In fact, if anything, it would be something that isn't spoken about broadly, even across the executive team or through the organisation. And one parallel that I've often drawn with sport is almost this genuine and authentic experience of being coached, to face into that week in, week out, and take on that feedback and then do something differently about it and then see how that change happens. But it's also quite public. What are your observations in terms of the parallels between sport and business in that sense of coaching?
Oh, I love that, Gabe. It's a really, really good observation. I play golf. I'm happy to talk about my coach and the challenges he has in helping me to get better. It's really interesting. I mean, I played cricket at a reasonable level, and I went on and coached at a high level, and I sort of regard myself as a chief executive. I see myself as a coach almost more than anything. I mean, clearly, a big part of my role is sort of executing on strategy and all of that sort of thing. But getting the best out of your people is a really important thing. The point that you're making, though, is that sort of external support. I've been listening to a few. If you listen to podcasts from people in the US, it's amazing. They're quite open. They're much more open than we are in talking about not only their coach in terms of performance, but also mental or psychology. And seeing my counsellor. I mean, they talk quite openly about that. And I think, maybe in the workplace, when you think about it, we should encourage that a little bit more. And there's no sign of weakness in that. It's actually a strength to recognise that none of us are perfect, and there's always opportunities to get better.
I think that's a good point you raise. I think we're seeing it evolve. But when I make the comparisons, Chris, to your point, between sport and business, the one area where I've always felt that sport is leading is that openness to feedback and desire to constantly improve on performance and be very genuine and authentic about the coaching that you receive to achieve that.
I just think about sport and my time as a cricketer. In my time, you didn't want to get caught talking to the sports psychologist. That was like a sign of weakness, and that there was something wrong. Well, what are you talking to him for, sort of thing. But today, it's talking to our kids. It's just like what you do. We've got two kids that are professional cricketers, and they talk about that quite openly about the opportunities to learn and to get better and to apply mechanisms that can form habits that improve performance.
I think that's fantastic.
But it hasn't quite translated to business, though. You wouldn't talk about your coach as a CEO necessarily.
You certainly wouldn't talk about your psychologist and the work that you're getting through that.
But, I think that's on us as leaders in organisations to say if we don't encourage it and you don't talk openly about it, then it's not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think similar things with things like the EAP programs, employee assistance programs. It's very rare in my experience that you hear a CEO ever say, when I access that, this is the benefit that I got from it. That transparency isn't yet there, but I feel like it's starting to make some shifts towards it. And sport is the real leader, I think, in being the voice to show it's okay. Not only is it okay, but it's beneficial.
Yeah, we just think about that example you gave. Incredibly powerful for a CEO or a senior manager to say, I had this issue and I accessed the AAP, and to commend it and recommend it is incredibly powerful, I think, particularly if they had a good experience from it.
Yeah, not done enough, I don't think. I'm interested in your thoughts, James, on you had 20 years as the CEO of Cricket Australia, and cricket, I guess, from my personal experience, was a very male-dominated and focused industry and sport. But over the last 20 years, it has changed significantly. And I'm curious about your thoughts on the cultural shifts that has happened and I guess the move towards greater equality between men and women.
Yeah. Look, I think personally it's been a fascinating journey for me in that role. I was 20 years at cricket. I was 17 years as CEO, but the first 3 years I was in a senior role, and I inherited some things that were quite formative for me in that subject that you're talking about. And the big thing that I would observe is that, as a starting point, cricket has for nearly 100 years been a sport for women. It's not well known. The first test match between Australia and England was in 1934 with women playing, and yet the women and the men and the administration of the game were very separate. And I would have been guilty as a player of looking quite in a sexist sort of fashion and a judgmental sort of fashion on the women's game versus the men's game. And when I got into the administration, I came to understand a little bit more about the women's game because we were, through Cricket Australia, or it was the Australian Cricket Board at the time, we were a major supporter of women's cricket. But the business of Women's Cricket Australia was basically one employee, $200,000 worth of revenue, of which we gave over, Cricket Australia gave over half of it. And it was an organisation that was operating by itself, independent of Cricket Australia. And when I started, there was a conversation going on about a possible integration with Women's Cricket Australia and the Australian Cricket Board. And the interesting part of that, and one of the people that were extremely influential for me in forming a different view was Quentin Bryce, who became Governor-General, but she was chair of Women's Cricket Australia at the time. And I think she had quite a lot of opposition around her board and throughout the women's cricket fraternity about the wisdom of getting together with the males who perhaps were judgmental and had a view and hadn't necessarily treated the women's cricketers well before. And we're running very different businesses, probably a $40 million business versus a $200,000 business. But the thing that she had a vision, and she saw, I think, Quentin's done some amazing things in her life, and she's been a real leader in that sort of space. And she had a vision to say, this is the way the world's going, and it is the best thing for women's cricket. And we went into a 2-year integration, which commenced right at the start of my time as CEO of Cricket Australia. So she continued to be chair, but we integrated the businesses and therefore the operations, and we made some promises to women's cricket, and that's where it started. And I just wanted to provide that little bit of background because she played an incredibly influential role a whole lot of women's cricketers and administrators to get them across the line, but also she had a big influence on us on the men's side. It was great learning for me. I mean, 2001 was the year that our daughter was born, and so throughout that was my first year as CEO, and so 17 years later, she basically grew up through that period, and there's a question of nature versus nurture in all of that, but she ended up being quite keen on cricket and football and traditional, perhaps male-dominated sports. But it was a bit of a journey there for me in that experience where I was probably judgmental and came to understand a little bit about the game and the women's game, and not really being that much different to the men's game.
We should fill in the blanks a little bit for those who don't know. Annabelle now plays for Australia, is a dominant player in the Australian women's cricket team, and your son plays Sheffield Shield. Is that right? So, yeah. So you were the weak link in the cricketing quality in your house. And
really let the side.
You did
down.
make a comeback though. You told me that at some point. You made a comeback in your career to play with them.
I did. When Will, our oldest, got to about 13. We worked out that the only way you could play on turf was to play in a senior competition. He had a few mates that were quite good cricketers, and so I said to the dads of these kids, well, these kids need to start playing on turf, and the only way they can do that is play in a men's competition. So why don't we get a team together and do it? And that's what we did for a couple of years, and then 5 years later, Tom, our youngest, came through. I actually tried to get to play with Annabelle as well in that same competition.
Right.
But they wouldn't let her play.
Let you? They wouldn't let her play?
No, because she was a she.
Oh, such a joke.
Ridiculous.
Wow. Look how much we're coming along and evolving. Yes. Isn't it great? Actually, I will share a very quick story of a lovely friend of mine, Helen Lee, who is a big supporter of women in sport. She was at Telstra as the head of people and culture. Now she's over at MYOB as the head of people and culture, and she got these tickets to go to the Women's World Cup in 2020 and invited us along. As a non-cricketer or non-cricket lover, I thought, oh, that sounds quite dull.
Really? Yeah.
And then I went to this event and it was mind-blowing.
Was that the final, the World Cup final?
It was the final. It was Australia versus India. And I have never experienced sport like it. The vibe of the audience there, of course, we're in COVID as well, but we weren't shut down yet. So it was...
It was literally a week before.
It was literally a week before.
Yeah.
And I'll just never forget the incredible emotion that went with seeing these phenomenal sporting people on the field and just getting so immersed and involved in it, but the entire crowd was, and it was... I don't know if it was a full house, but it looked like it from where I was sitting.
86,000.
Over 86,000.
How do you know that?
Yeah, we looked it up.
Did you?
I didn't look it up.
I was like, wow, that's a stat that you've just been able to pull from nowhere. It was an amazing experience and it got me hooked. And after that, I've really been invested in, I'm not dedicated to knowing every player, but I enjoy it now. I enjoy watching it. I've got to say I probably only enjoy the women's one. I haven't really started to re-engage with the men's one, but just that I couldn't believe the cultural evolution of women in sport. I think it had passed me by because I'd sort of maybe rejected it because of how little there was the appreciation for women's ability. And seeing that, I thought that is phenomenal. So thank you for everything that you've done to make that a reality.
So tell us about that night, James, because that's actually as a result of some of the decisions that you made in you and others, and Quentin Bryce and people like the influential decision makers at that time. That's almost the impact of some of those early decisions. Tell us about that night at the MCG with 86,000 people watching the World Cup final.
Look, I think it was, when I look at my time, and I'd left Cricket Australia by then, but I was on the board of the World Cup, so I was still involved in the event. And when I think about my time in cricket as an administrator, that was undoubtedly the highlight of my whole time. I saw some great times in Australian cricket, but that was just a phenomenal night. So I share your joy at being there and experiencing it. I don't know, Chris. It's a sort of a long story. I could say so much about that night. The first thing I'd say is you go back to that moment or that time where I was talking before about Quentin Rice and that vision of what the game might become, and the question about whether you integrate the men and the women together and what might come of that. Right at the start of I was 34 or something when I became CEO, so I was definitely wet behind the ears and didn't have any experience as a CEO. But if you had told me when we were entering that integration that 19 years later, you're going to have a World Cup final and there was going to be 86,000 people there, it would have been just preposterous as an idea. And so you need, so sometimes things can happen really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that sort of I've come to learn in business, that is that if you actually push the boat out far enough and you create a vision and you have a real sense of purpose around that, and obviously strategy and execution are all really important around that, sometimes you just can't believe what can be achieved. And it didn't, it sort of happened by accident, but it didn't happen by accident because there were a whole lot of building blocks along the way. And simple things like my successor in the role, Kevin Roberts, he reported to me at the time where we had the hosting rights to the World Cup, and we had this conversation around, well, where will we play it? We've got the rights to host the Women's World Cup final. Where will we play it? And your natural inclination is to say, well, what sort of size crowd do we expect? And then you think about a ground that's going to fit that crowd. So it's a great celebration of the game. And you think, 10, 15,000. Do you think we could do it at the MCG? That'd be 40,000. That might be stretching it. And he said, no, well, let's do it at the MCG. MCG holds 100,000 people. That's just a silly idea.
Crazy.
But if you don't, that's pushing the boat out, and that's saying, well, why not? And but then a whole lot of other things had to fall in place, including Australia winning, because Australians aren't probably going to turn up and watch other teams play in the World Cup final. And there was a remarkable match the week before where we won the semi-final to get through that we nearly lost, or the rain nearly intervened and cost us a spot. But so a whole lot of things fell into place. And sometimes you get lucky, but there's a lot of other things. There are a lot of other building blocks there and momentum that was there. That was amazing. A story that one of my favourite moments, you'll remember the Katy Perry concert afterwards, and her bringing the girls up on stage to sing, I think it was Firework or
yes,
the song?
Yeah.
And they were all up there dancing with her, and I was just looking at it and going, this is just, we've had the World Cup, we had 86,000 people, and then these girls are with a superstar.
You couldn't watch that without crying. Yep. It was just, I tried, but there were a lot of tears. And at the end of all, I was in the main ICC, International Cricket Council hospitality room, and the concert had finished and everything was just dying down. There were people just sort of sitting around on tables having a drink. And Charlotte Edwards, who's one of England's greatest ever cricketers, recently retired, maybe 4 or 5 years retired. I walked past her, I'll never forget this, and she looked up at me and she just goes, "What the F just happened then?" And she meant the whole day. And she was just like, I've been playing cricket for 25 years.
Yeah, right.
And this is what the game has become. I cannot believe it. And I just thought it was quite a moving moment, because she's a great pioneer in the game, great cricketer. And she just looked up and I thought, oh, that's great. That's nice coming from her.
That's brilliant.
That's a legacy worth leaving right there.
Well, let's talk about some of those building blocks that got you to that point. As you say, 17 years as CEO. No doubt to make some of those harder decisions, you had to have a great team behind you, or you were at least leading that team. You've essentially, you've achieved incredible things, but the industry in cricket, and I am keen to talk about golf as well, they're pretty stuffy industries. They're a fair bit conservative, and I can't imagine you knocking on the door at Lord's to say, "Hi, this is James from Australia. Can we use a pink ball in the cricket? Can we do a day-night test? Can we start to change the colour? Like, you've disrupted a very conservative arena. I think the other part of that is you're disrupting something which is actually under the public microscope. So as an Australian, we feel a sense of ownership in that team. That's kind of our brand. And I can't imagine what that must be like to be making some of those harder decisions to change an industry for what you believe was going to be better. And ultimately, with the benefit of hindsight, it was a hell of a lot better for the game. But how do you get a team behind you? How do you get buy-in from your team, from your staff? How do you get belief to go on that potentially rocky journey for all of those people to come with you?
I think it's probably, it starts with having a sense of duty around growth. I think, grow, you're there. Bradman used to say, we're all custodians of the game, and it's our duty to leave the game in a better place than we found it. And I used to always think about that in my role in terms of how you continue to grow the game, because there's, sporting organisations, at least in Australia, tend to be not-for-profit organisations, which means that you don't pay dividends, you generate revenue, and if you want the game to grow, you need to generate more revenue or more surplus revenue so that you can invest back in the game and create some sort of a virtuous cycle. So that was always my philosophy, and thinking about how you can grow from that. We've talked a bit about the women's game, and that is, my view on that was, it wasn't just the right thing to do. It was actually a business imperative. It was, if you want to be relevant in modern day society, you need to be a sport for all. And the truth of the matter was that cricket wasn't a sport for all. And we needed to create more opportunities. We needed to be more welcoming. The hard part on the women's side of things is that cricket generally has been a sport that's been administrated by males who didn't necessarily have that. And I'm the first to admit that I had a fixed mindset that wasn't terribly open-minded, but I was, from within, we had some really influential women that helped me to understand what might be possible, and also would, if not bang the table, at least give you a gentle nudge and say, that's actually not quite fair, or this isn't, that's actually not right, or what have you. And people like Belinda Clark and Steph Beltrami and others were particularly influential for me in helping me. And I think in my own family environment, I had a wife that was quite strong on that, and that was aided through my early times as a CEO, where we had kids playing sport. We had 2 boys and a girl in the middle, perhaps because she was surrounded by brothers on either side of her. She wanted to play the same sports as them, and cricket and football. And to that end, that was an eye-opener for me, because I didn't see – I looked at the women's game, girls and women's game, cricket, through a certain lens, and it wasn't until my own daughter started to play that I actually had a dose of reality that I thought I was on board. Put it this way, I thought I was on board as a new age sports administrator doing great things in this integration of the women's game, but I didn't realise how hard it was for girls or women to play a male-dominated sport until my daughter started playing it. And my wife was particularly influential in me understanding that, or where I had blind spots around that. And that was incredibly powerful. So I know we're not just talking about the women's side of it in terms of initiatives and change, but I wanted to make that point around not just the people that I worked with, who were incredibly important in driving that, but also that family environment and the personal experience that really changed my outlook, and I think sort of almost turbocharged my sort of determination to move at least that, to make moves on the women's side. In terms of other initiatives, I think, as I said before, it comes down to the sort of that growth, that that duty to grow and develop. But there's. I mean, we can go into some of those examples, Chris, but each one has their own story in some ways, and change isn't difficult. change always has its enemies for whatever reason. But if it's couched in the right way, change should be progress, and it should be about growth and helping the sport to be better. And I guess that was always the initial mindset, and then try to make it stack up and then influence others to have the same. Because in sport, one of the things in sport as a sports administrator, because we operate in a federal governance model, you actually don't have unilateral authority over much. You have to influence in order to get decisions, and you have to get collective support in order to move things forward. So that was always challenging, but as long as you understand that from the outset, that's what you're working with, then that's a good start.
James, I'm curious, you spoke earlier about having a clear vision and purpose and pushing the boat out far enough and seeing how far you can take something. We often subscribe to the theory that you need to build the culture that you want internally first to be able to influence out into society. And I really want to know how, in your tenure at Cricket Australia and now moving over to Golf Australia, how do you create that aligned culture internally so that you can influence out and see the types of change that you've created?
I'm probably a believer that I can understand views and thoughts that people might believe that culture comes first, but for me, it's more about purpose and direction first, and then getting an alignment behind that, because I think that culture grows from that sense of collective purpose and direction. And I really like that, that sense of having a vision. The big, hairy, audacious goal sort of thing. That concept of really, and that's the putting the boat out sort of thing. Like, what if we got all of our shit together? What could we achieve? And I think that for me, potential is sort of a word that can be underutilized. It's actually something that in sport and in the coaching ranks of high performance sport, they talk about a lot. They talk about what a person's potential is. Where can this player get to? And I think as a business or a department or in individuals within our organisations, to think about the potential is something that we don't do enough of. And I remember in my time in cricket, we were going through a really difficult stage where we were changing the governance model. So we had a federal governance model, and where states had a very strong hold on the way the game was operated, and that was historic, and that's not a bad thing, because that's sort of how our country works. But at the same time, there was some change going on, and our chairman of the day, Wally Edwards, was going through a very difficult time. In fact, his own state had sort of turned on him, and I said, Wally, what, you're volunteer administrator, chairman of the board, what are you doing? Why do you put yourself through this? And he said, James, all I want is for cricket to achieve its potential. And it's always struck me as being something that, we've always got a duty to that potential, but it's easy to say. It's another thing to actually think about what that potential is, and then join the dots and say, okay, if that's our potential, then how do we get there, and how do we best achieve that? And so for me, that's how I like to think of building strategy, is to think about, well, what's our potential? Let's sit around here and talk about what our potential is. Imagine a world where cricket was, or golf is this. What is it? And how do we get there? And is it possible? And what would need to happen? It's almost that blank sheet of paper sort of concept. You got to do that every now and again, I think, and not just because we can get too micro and just think about the challenges of the day. But how do you clear the decks and say, well, this is where we're going to go? So that's where I start from in terms of thinking about how you build a strategy from there, and then a sense of, well, if everyone understands that, what is this vision, that sense of purpose that comes from it, I think builds, culture builds from that, because culture builds from, a shared space, shared environment, ideally shared objectives.
So now at Golf Australia, of all the things that you've done, why did you make that decision? Why was that your next move? And applying, some of that cultural lens to exactly what you were saying before, where is Golf Australia at, and where is it? Where would you like it to get to?
Well, without being too flippant, my three favourite sports are footy, cricket and golf. And I'd worked in footy and cricket and I hadn't worked at golf.
Footy next.
I was shot at netball.
It's somewhat flippant response, but I do love golf. Opportunity presented itself. I wasn't desperately seeking to get back into sort of chief executive role, but the opportunity presented, the right people approached me about it, and the more I sort of scratched the surface, the more I saw there was sort of something going on in the game that I felt was opportunity and potential. You know, there was some potential there that was untapped, and the game was and still is on the rise, and it's great to be a part of a sport and an organisation that's growing.
I'm really interested in your observations when you compare the culture in cricket now and the culture in golf, particularly from that equality perspective of men and women's. What have you noticed?
It's a good question. I think that generally speaking, you know, the administrators have a vision for the sport that is sort of running a little bit ahead of the community and the grassroots. Although I think the grassroots is catching up. Certainly, it's interesting. You know, the average age of a member of a golf club is 50 something, late 50s.
Surely.
Yeah. So female 62. I think the male's sort of 57. So golf is a sport for adults more so. That's not to say kids don't play it and don't enjoy it. They do. But there's a lot that golf can learn from the increasing egalitarianism that's in junior sport today. And there's been a real rise. You know, cricket has been great at it. Football, soccer, round ball football has been very good at it for a long time, and just basketball. Kids are welcome no matter what. And I mean, it's actually not that long ago that certainly when Annabelle, our daughter, was growing up and she was at primary school, if she wanted to play cricket or football, she had to play in a boys' team. But in the last 10 years, that's changed. There are enough girls wanting to play the game now, and therefore they're encouraged to play the game. Now, golf's always been a sport for women, but it's still hard for women to come to the game, and the administration of golf in a club environment and elsewhere is still male dominated, and I'm not sure that everywhere they have got a mindset around, you know, it's not just the right thing to do. It's also a business imperative if you can encourage more women into the game. It's interesting in the last 50 years, we've gone from 50 years ago, 33% of members of golf clubs were female, and it's now down to 19%.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So there was a very strong, 1 in 3 members of a golf club were female 50 years ago. It's coming back. It's rising, and certainly the initiatives that we have shared by our state associations, and some clubs are adopting some great initiatives that are bringing women back to the game. I was recently at a party, and a friend of my wife came up to me and said, she's similar age to me, and in her 50s, and she said, she realised that I was working in golf. She said, I am addicted to golf. I just love it. Yeah. She said, she's been playing for 2 years. She said, I've got one regret. I didn't start earlier.
Yeah, right.
And that's happening. I can see that happening. There's a really strong vibe about the game. Girls and women are discovering the game.
Yeah, and also the potential for younger people to discover the game. It's not really something that I ever hear about children or teenagers going off to play a game of golf. So there's huge potential in being able to think about it from a diversity and equity perspective overall for people from different backgrounds, different ages. You got a few things to achieve.
Yeah. Look, and I think the game, the face of the game and the way in which people play the game, engage with the game is changing. That's one of the reasons why it is on the rise at the moment. So, the traditional view and most people's sort of north-facing view on golf is that it's a pretty private game. It's male-dominated. Sort of maybe happens that you've got to be a member of a club to play. You've got to play green grass golf. But the actual reality is that you can go to a driving range, you can go to mini golf. You don't have to give up 5 hours of the day to play golf. You can go to a driving range, have fun with your mates. There's now technology in place where you can play a game in half an hour, and that's kids are really attracted to that. So it's fun. Mini golf's big, but driving ranges and technology are really coming together. And so the face of the game is changing, and what that means is the sport's offering. Got a whole lot of different offerings for different people.
It's a very different sort of cultural shift, inclusion and mindset, that it is no longer the traditional view that you have to be a member of a club in order to play. The public access to the game is changing pretty rapidly. Yep. Where has that still got to go? How is that progressing? And do you have the same level of senior women in leadership positions in golf? And how far does that have to go? Same as it was for cricket.
No, and we've actually just or a number of ladies have come to us about setting up a women's golf leadership network, which are basically a group of women who are in senior positions in golf clubs around Australia, and we're supporting, sponsoring them, if you like, to get together and talk more about their issues and challenges as women in golf clubs, but also for women and girls in golf. And I think that will, that's a really, really good initiative, because golf clubs can operate in their own little silo, and sometimes things aren't shared about best practice or worst practice and how people can solve problems together. And women are great at that. Women are fantastic as great volunteers, great administrators, and they're great at sharing information and ideas. And I'm really optimistic about how this group of women is going to make a big impact on our sport in the next 10 years. And I think that, part of it is also males. Sometimes in my time in cricket, I used to speak to groups of people, a lunch or a dinner or what have you, and by and large, they would be male-dominated audiences. And in reflecting on the women's game, for example, I would say, I would ask them, a show of hands, how many of you have daughters? Maybe half of them put their hand up. How many of your daughters play cricket? And all the hands would go down. There might be one or two left in the room. And I said, so all of you guys love cricket. Half of you have daughters, and yet none of them play. What's happened? Why not? And I think that that sense of obligation. I mean, how great is it to have a daughter where you share an interest in a footy team or playing a sport that you love, and golf is actually one of those sports where you can actually play. I mean, because you can play forever. Yeah, right. It's a great family sport, and there's so much joy to be had from that. And so I think there's a sense of custodianship and duty that the males have to the game, not just to daughters, but to their kids, to encourage them into the game. And I think that it's one of my observations about golf is it doesn't have the same sense of custodianship that others do. And that's because as a 50-odd-year-old bloke like I am, we're thinking about our next game of golf. We're not thinking about who else we're going to introduce to the game.
Yeah, right. We've talked about a lot of the great successes that you've had in your career, James. I'm not interested in getting to the low points, but I'm always keen to hear from the leaders that we speak to about some of the lessons that you've learned from some of the tough parts of your career. Is there a lesson that you've had to learn the hard way that has potentially changed the way that you work forevermore?
Well, there's probably a couple of things in that. I think that being the leader of a quite public organisation that's under a lot of media scrutiny, there's a sense of awareness and understanding that sometimes your number comes up and things go wrong, and people people are entitled to. People feel passionately about what you do, about cricket or football or golf or whatever it might be, and they're entitled to those opinions. So I always used to, I guess, respect that view. But I think you've just got to work through those. When the number comes up, you've got to work through those things, and it gets better. But you've got to step your way through it. I think the other thing that I learnt through some of those challenging and difficult times is the role, the really important role that a board and particularly a chairman can have in that. And in my time in cricket, when there's a whole lot of noise and things are being written in the newspaper and whatever it happened 2 or 3 times a year where there would be a big issue that people had an opinion about and bad things were being written about the administration or the sport or whatever. As a chief executive, you can sort of feel as though you're in the firing line and you've really got a lot of, the burners are on you. But to have the support of, non-executives who say, we've got a strategy, we'll just focus on, step by step working through it, I think is really important. And I've thought about that a lot and those experiences that I had and the support that I had during that time from non-executives, chairman or other directors. And I guess I've tried to apply that as best I can in my non-executive roles as well. Because it's pretty difficult being a chief executive and a senior person, particularly in organisations where you are under a lot of scrutiny. And in this day and age, media attention is immediate, it's digital, it's all supplemented by the keyboard warriors who have views that they express. And for me personally, I would never read below the line. I might read articles from time to time, but I would never read below the line because it doesn't really matter.
Nothing's going to come from that.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah, exactly. And I think, but that's one of the things for me is it's, and I'm a strategy. I'm not a strategist, but I'm a devotee of strategy and a belief in setting a path and a direction, and to know that you're not diverging from that, or that you've got the support of the board to continue to step in that direction it's important, but it's actually really powerful, and it's psychologically important as well, I think, for in a CEO role. But I think if you actually take that down a level, it's actually really important from a CEO perspective as well, to continue to, when things go wrong like they do, to support your people and say, shit happens, but remember, this is where we're going, and this is where this is the direction we're going, and you've got my support.
James is conscious of time. I have one last question for you, and it is one I often get asked in interviews. You have spoken a lot about your family and also about your career, and I'm curious about how you have reconciled with focusing on your career and having a family that doesn't always have your attention. How have you managed that, and what are the challenges that you've faced?
Lots of challenges. I think the starting point is that I could never have done what I did in an executive sense without an incredibly supportive wife and I guess understanding family. It did help that we had 3 kids that loved cricket, as my wife Heidi has been known to say from time to time, all your kids love cricket and it's all your fault. But she did take the attitude, if you can't beat them, join them, which I'm eternally grateful for, and I'm still absolutely in her debt, because particularly during those 20 years in cricket, 17 as CEO, there was a lot of travel and a lot of distractions and all of that. As I said, it did help from the kids' perspective in terms of their growing up, that they had some sort of a relationship with the game, that it wasn't foreign to them, and they didn't resent it quite as much as some might. But I think the other thing, Gabe, for me is in that time I tried as best I can, except when I was probably travelling overseas, I always tried to be home on weekends. So they were the things that I used to try to do was to try to be home on weekends and try to support the kids' activities, even though it wasn't necessarily possible as much during the week. But I also because I had a coaching background and what have you, I also made a commitment to coach the kids' sport in various, even some sports I knew nothing about, to be honest. But I felt that in doing that, it actually made a commitment that it put in my diary and created a discipline that meant that I could bump other things when a work thing came up. I'd already prioritised it because that's a proper commitment. If you're going to coach a team, you're committed to doing that for the season. That's how I saw it. Sure, if I was overseas and I couldn't coach that week, I'd do it, but I'd arrange for someone else. But the point was that I actually purposely put things in the diary to make sure that I committed to that. And it's not just a week-to-week commitment, it was a longer-term thing. And I enjoyed that and loved that, but it was also about prioritising and having a bit of discipline that forced me into that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Christopher?
I think we're done. That's
excellent.
Fantastic. Thanks,
Thank
James.
you so much, James. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you. I'm so excited to see what you do with Golf Australia. And no doubt we'll continue chatting along the way.
Thanks, Gabe. Nice to chat. You too, Chris.
Thanks, James. Cheers.
Well, Chris, I absolutely enjoyed that conversation with James today. What a fascinating fella. Just hearing about his upbringing, his passion for sport, how he then took that into essentially evolving the culture of cricket. Quite phenomenal when you think about it from a women's perspective and how far women's cricket has come. I know for me, that has been a fundamental shift in my mindset and belief, but also passion for watching these athletes do incredible things out there. Really good to hear about some of those parallels between sport and business and how we authentically face into coaching and development in sport, but we're still evolving in that space in business. So for all of you out there that are still trying to hide away your coaches and psychologists, come to the party and shout it out loud and proud. We're going to be chatting with some really interesting guests next week, so I hope you can join us for that too. I'm really excited about the next conversation. And to wrap up some of my key takeaway from the conversation with James, what I really loved was hearing about him talk in relation to understanding opportunity and potential. Once you get clarity on what that potential is, you can turn it into a compelling purpose, which allows you to set the strategy and direction. And from there, build the culture that's going to support you to deliver on that expectation. Until next time, take care.